their Genesis grant. And so we received funding from a foundation that basically supports initiatives to raise the awareness of extreme weather. And that's exactly what we're doing here today. We're also inviting a half a dozen school classes here later in the week, doing very much the same kind of a presentation for the school kids so they can teach their parents what to do, but also to encourage them to consider careers in weather, water, science, and oceanography. So that's a wonderful opportunity as well. I'd like to remind you as well, a number of you who registered would have gotten a survey in email. I'd really like you to fill out that survey. Your perspective as members of the public are really important to us within the meteorological community. And so I'd encourage you to complete that survey. And if you don't have it in your email, we've got a number of little sheets here. You can just stick your phone onto the QR code there and it'll bring up the link to the survey. So if you could do the survey sometime today, not during the talk, of course, but afterwards, that would be wonderful. We have a number of housekeeping notices. One is, and I just checked, these should be set to silent, so cell phones to silent. If there is an evacuation, not anticipating any extreme weather, but if there is need for an evacuation, there will be an alarm that sounds. Wait for an announcement before doing anything. And then if there is a second alarm, then the hotel staff will lead us out the door into a safe muster place. The washrooms are out that door and to my right, to your left. Your right when you go that way. When you would like to ask questions to the panelists, we'd ask you to use the microphones because this is also being recorded as well as delivered virtually. So one thing we're doing this Congress for the first time ever is actually offering an in-person and a virtual component. So we're all kind of guinea pigs. We've never done this before. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming and taking the time to spend with us to learn a little bit about the business we do and how to be better prepared for some of the things we're seeing and will see that we've never seen before. We will be giving some door prizes out afterwards, and also we'll be planting some trees here in Newfoundland, Labrador, and for each registration that you've provided and our registrants have provided, we're going to be planting a tree in celebration of our time here in Newfoundland. And I'd just like to turn it over to two individuals that I met for the first time, in front of a camera, of course. Ashley and Eddie from CBC and NTV. So thankful for you and the panelists to be here, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. So I'm Ashley Brauweiler. I I'm a meteorologist for CBC here in Newfoundland and Labrador.
And I'm Eddie Sheerr. I'm the meteorologist for NTV here in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. And we're going to co-host this panel, which is called Navigating Extreme Weather in Newfoundland and Labrador. And all the panelists here to my left are experts in various things with respect to meteorology and extreme events. And they have some very interesting things to say. And I think we're all going to be very interested with a few presentations that they are going to have before we get to our question and answer session. So before we move forward with that, Ashley and I have prepared a couple of slides. And the first one is a quote from my father-in-law. And it says, Newfoundland and Labrador doesn't get a lot of extreme weather, but we do get a lot of bad weather. And, you know, that's very true. Like, the weather here can be, you know, for lack of a better term, pretty crappy. You know, as we've seen this spring, especially on the Avalon, where it's been pretty cloudy and cool and damp, and I think we were spoiled by last summer. Did
Last
you
summer,
say the same?
100%.
Yeah.
I had plants in already.
And last summer and last spring were kind of like an anomaly. Like it was really nice, it was really warm, which was in and of itself kind of an extreme weather event for Newfoundland because it was so unlike the summers that we typically get. But when it comes to extreme weather, we do get it. And when we do get it, it's generally pretty notable, and the systems that come through can be quite severe. Before we move on talking a little bit about that, for those that don't know, I moved to Newfoundland, Labrador from the USA in August of 2013, and I'm now basically anchored to Newfoundland because I married a Newfoundlander.
Absolutely the same. I moved to Newfoundland, Labrador in October of 2018, and I'm originally from Southern Ontario, but I've worked in a number of different areas. I've worked in Ottawa, I worked in the Northwest Territories up in Yellowknife, and so I've seen my fair share of extreme weather and, you know, blizzards and all that sort of stuff, and then I moved to Newfoundland, and then that's where my journey with, you know, severe weather really began. You know, within the first couple of years, I had quite a few storms that I'd say were one of the biggest of my career, and then that kept happening. And hopefully that doesn't continue to happen, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
But yeah, so when I worked in a couple of different places in the States before I moved to Newfoundland and Labrador. And when I came up here for an interview, it was May of 2013, and it was like this. It was like 20 degrees and sunny, and I was taken out to lunch by my general manager at NTV, Lindsay Andrews, and a couple of other people, and Lindsay said to me, you know, it doesn't snow that much in St. John's, and it's not that cold. Compared to other places in the province, that's very correct.
Yeah.
But like my first winter here, we had like 100 and something centimeters of snow in December, and I had never seen anything like that. And that was kind of my introduction to Newfoundland Labrador weather, and that was followed by kind of dark NL, which was my first, you know, sort of extreme event because we had a strong storm come through. It deepened to like 930 something millibars north of Newfoundland up towards Greenland. We had high winds, temperature was like -14, -15, and a lot of the province was without power for a few days during that. And that was my first big story. And, you know, we've had countless strong storms and countless snowstorms, but obviously, you know, the big one, and I've got some video to share with you in a second, was Snowmageddon in January 2020. That was the biggest and worst storm I think I've ever experienced in my entire life, you know, to put that into perspective.
Absolutely, and I said the same thing. And, you know, that storm kind of made me remember or realize why we become meteorologists. And a lot of the times it's to prepare the public, prepare ourselves for big storms so that we all know they're coming and we can all mitigate the risk. And that I found that storm really gave me a good idea of what I should talk about, what's important, and, you know, every storm since have learned a lot more about that. But yeah, I remember we chatted just before that storm happened, and we were both like, is this seriously gonna happen? Like, that's a big storm.
Yeah, when you're looking at the days out, and it's all like the same, because you know when we've had snowstorms, they don't always work out,
No.
right? Like sometimes they're not right. Like forecasts are generally not great sometimes. But with the big ones, the forecasts are generally like pretty good.
Pretty good, yeah.
Several days out, and that was Snowmageddon. It was like, this can't
be real. Yeah.
And then you get excited.
Yeah.
Because as a meteorologist, like weather just excites, you know, some part of you that you don't even know why.
Especially when it's like textbook.
Yeah.
You only see it in a textbook and you're like, okay, this is really gonna happen.
It's super exciting, but then you have to realize there's always a human element to it as well. And, you know, some of the stuff can be life-threatening. So when you see us on TV getting excited about a big storm, generally that's probably not great for the public. And, you know, and then since then, you know, we've had Larry, and last year we had Fiona and various heavy rain events, and I had AR there for probably atmospheric rivers, because a lot of those were kind of driven by that. And we don't want to take up too much time, so we'll share the video. And this is video that I've never shared publicly, because at the time I probably would have gotten in a lot of trouble, and I might, because the video you're about to see is from Snowmageddon when no one was supposed to be out on the roads. So this was, so basically what happened was I was going live from my house because I was stuck at home during Snowmageddon, and I got a phone call from work and was like, basically you got to come in because your live feed's not working. So NTV sent a tractor and a plow to come get me out of my house. I think we're the only two things on the road. So this is some of the video as we were kind of leaving my house and going to work.
Plow will be in. Right. When we get on tour, you should, you know. It's the end of Pine Line. Victoria Road? Yep.
That was outside of CBC, where I was stuck all night, and I slept under my desk. Those cars were completely buried by the end of it. That was the middle of the night. It was intense. Yeah.
And a lot of people with NTV were stuck as well, but not me, because I got a tractor to get me home too. So that's you know, what we have to say, and now we'll turn it over to the panelists here off to my left.
Oh, you can keep going.
Oh, so we forgot to get to that. But anyway, we'll run through these real fast. I forgot we have one slide. So just to summarize things up, so as Ashley and I kind of said, the big storms are generally the easiest to forecast. The smaller ones can pose significant challenges in and of themselves. And across the province, we've got microclimates and large geographic regions that can basically make getting a forecast right for every area extremely challenging. And we will never get any forecast right for all areas, but it doesn't mean we can't try.
No.
Okay, that's it, I think.
There you go.
All right. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here today. So my name is David Neal. I'm the warning preparedness meteorologist for Newfoundland and Labrador. I'll explain a little bit later what that is for folks who don't know what that role entails. But I've been at the Newfoundland and Labrador Weather Office in Gander since 2010. So we had 13 years as a forecaster at the Newfoundland and Labrador Weather Office. So I guess really, why are we interested in these big severe events other than the fact of being a meteorologist, being interested in these major events? Weather, of course, has a major impact. When you do get these big events, they can be quite catastrophic in the sense of just not only human cost, but in terms of just overall cost. So basically in 2022, in Canada, we had $3.1 billion in insured damage. That's according to the Insurance Bureau of Canada. Fiona on its own, as we're talking about post-tropical storm Fiona, caused about 800 million of that damage. For a single weather event, that's seventh most in Canadian history. And as we've been going through the 2000s, 4 of the costliest weather events that we've had in this country have happened in the 2020s. We're not even halfway through the decade. So some of those numbers are, as I said, from the Insurance Bureau, but also this graphic here just highlighted Hurricane Fiona here. That was, of course, a big one that impacted our province. Overall, when you include the Caribbean as well, looking at about $4 billion in damage and a little over 20 lives as well. So this is basically you can see kind of what these major events, what they can do. It's quite eye-opening. So I'm just going to step a little bit through basically kind of what we do at Environment Climate Change Canada. First and foremost, kind of how we go about building a forecast. So basically, at the Newfoundland and Labrador Weather Office in Gander, we're 24/7. There are meteorologists on duty at all times. Always watching the weather, always updating forecasts and bulletins. And on every shift, forecasters go through a process of analysis, diagnosis, prognosis. So basically the analysis, what's happening right now, and then the diagnosis, well, why. So that's the what and the why. And then the prognosis is kind of how you produce a forecast. With all that information taken into account, what do we think is going to happen next? And then, of course, step number 4 is the verification. After the fact, did what we think would happen actually happen? So it's a constant loop of how a forecast is built. I'm going to focus a little bit more closely here on the more event-driven weather, the bottom part here, the color coding here. So basically, these are the alerts that we will put out when we're expecting something fairly significant. So first, we have the special weather statements. I'm sure you've seen that at times. Pretty sure I saw a meme at some point that winter season just is basically special weather statement in effect. That's pretty much the entire winter. So we issue those for a couple of different reasons, mainly for something significant that we're expecting, but more in kind of that day 3 to 5 time frame. So something to kind of give that sort of initial, that's the first heads up. Another time we'll use that will be something that's not quite to warning criteria, but could be something that could be a little bit tricky, could cause some issues. We'll sometimes use it then as well. Then as we go, we start stepping up in severity. The advisories, those are more lower impact weather events, but could still cause some problems. Things like blowing snow, freezing drizzle, those sorts of things. We step up to the watches when we're expecting that conditions are going to be favorable for development of certain significant weather types. So you're talking kind of like severe thunderstorm watches, as well as tropical storm watches, things like that. And then we start to step up to more of the warnings. Those, with the exception of the severe thunderstorm warning, typically, though those can have a couple of hours of lead time at most, but most of the warnings usually looking 12 to 24 hours out, and that's when we're expecting significant weather. So it's kind of like your wind warnings, your storm surge, those sorts of things. That's when we step it up to our warnings. All of these bulletins and forecasts, especially the bulletins, are disseminated by various means. Of course, on the evening newscast with Ashley and Eddie, you see those bulletins. That's one place where those are disseminated. Also, you go to the weather.gc.ca website, would be another spot, as well as our relatively new app called WeatherCan. And there are several other areas where you can access information for those. So that's a little bit about kind of what really just the kind of the nuts and bolts of our weather office. Again, we do forecasts for the province of Newfoundland and Labrador and offshore waters. So kind of coming now to more what my role is. So the warning preparedness meteorologist. In a nutshell, we really serve as a link between those operational forecasters, those 24/7 meteorologists that work at the weather office, and we're kind of a link to kind of external partners and clients, as well as to the public as well. So 3 kind of main roles. Number 1, we do tend to handle any media requests that come into Environment and Climate Change Canada related to weather. I guess as a nutshell, the operational forecasters at the NLWO, they also handle media. We're mainly during business hours, but also during major events. So just as an example, during Fiona, in the lead up to Fiona, all the way up to about a week or so after, I think we responded to somewhere on the order of about 170 media requests for that. Most of those in English, mais il y a eu quelques demandes en français aussi. So that's one of our roles. Also for those lead-ins, as you can see in the picture there, that's Bob Robichaud. He's the WPM for the Canadian Hurricane Center. He'll usually hold a media briefing where we'll go over some of the information and take questions as well. One of our other main role is a link with the emergency management community in different provinces. So for myself, we're very closely with emergency managers in Newfoundland and Labrador, usually providing specialized weather briefing material. As we get to a little more major events, or what we're expecting to be more major events, we'll also do targeted briefings. And as well, kind of more routine things, we also help out with emergency planning and exercising as well. And finally, we also, in terms of more public-facing roles, we also will provide post-storm weather information whenever there's a need for disaster financial assistance. So that's kind of your federal government funding when there's a major disaster. And also too, there are usually a few different questions or concerns that may come across the desk, and they tend to find their way to us. So that's basically it for kind of the Environment Climate Change Canada role, a little bit there, kind of in a nutshell, but there's some ways too that you can get involved in keeping yourself safe during major weather events, but also how you can kind of give us a little bit more weather information for our forecasting and for observing. So basically we have the getprepared.gc.ca. There are a few of these that will be included with a couple of the door prizes. So lots of great information here on how to prepare yourself in case of an emergency. One of the main takeaways here is this, the 72 hours in the circle here. Basically, when you get some of these major weather events or a disaster, it can take emergency crews up to 72 hours to get to your location. So there's lots of great tips there on how to basically prepare yourself and to gather supplies to be prepared in case you need to kind of hang in there for 72 hours. This is a new platform that we've since launched. It's called Let's Talk Weather, Parlons Météo. It's a new consultation service. Okay, thank you. So basically you can, it's a means to give us feedback on what we currently offer in terms of products and services, but also to some things that will allow us to continue to improve the weather service in the future as well. Also, different ways of reporting severe weather. Many of the meteorologists on the desk, along with your satellite, your radar, observations, will also have Twitter open and have hashtag NLWX up. It's a good way to kind of fill in some gaps. We don't have eyes everywhere, so it's always good to get some of these different reports, especially in areas where we don't have an observation. We are watching that quite closely, and it does help us at times, especially the forecasters who are working on the desk. Also, too, if you're not much of a Twitter user, there are other ways that you can get this weather information to us. If you have any photos or anything interesting to share, there's an email address here. And I'll just mention too that a lot of these links don't necessarily have to rush to write any of them down or take pictures. We will have a slide at the end that will put up with a lot of this information on it, so you'll be able to get it all from there. And last but not least, if you enjoy weather, if you want to, if you like taking observations, there's a means to become a volunteer weather observer. There's the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network, otherwise known as COCORAS. Originally established in the United States, we do have a section for the country here. So basically, we take volunteer observations of precipitation totals. And just to focus here on the map, the reason I kind of bring this up is, again, we don't have eyes everywhere. It's always nice to get whatever information we can to help ground truth our forecasts and to help improve them going forward. So as you can see, the Maritimes there, can barely see the map because of the number of dots that are there. Lots and lots of observations. Newfoundland and Labrador still not too much there. So. I know the door prizes today are COCORAS precipitation gauges, so if you happen to win one and you're not overly into taking weather observations yourself, but you happen to know somebody in like Port Saunders or something like that, by all means, see if you
Or
can.
Torbay.
There you go, or Torbay. Yep, even better, Labrador, anywhere in Labrador. Why not? Send it along and see if you can twist our arm to get us some more weather info. So again, thanks for having me today, and I'll pass it over to Chris.
Okay, thank you. My name's Chris Fogarty. I work with the Environment and Climate Change Canada, the Canadian Hurricane Center, and David and I, we communicate on occasion when we get the tropical events, the hurricanes, and so I'll talk a little bit about the Hurricane Center, part of what we do at Environment and Climate Change Canada. Now, as you know, Newfoundland can definitely get tropical systems. Hurricanes do visit the area, and Eddie was showing earlier there in his slide, 2021 was the last like true bona fide hurricane, if you will, to hit Newfoundland, and that was went up into the eastern part of the Burin Peninsula, and most of the wind from that storm affected the Avalon Peninsula, the highest winds here in St. John's. So that was a surprisingly tropical looking system when it hit Newfoundland. Much different than Fiona last year, which was a much larger system. You recall probably that the maritime provinces were hit pretty intensely with Fiona. And then, of course, the southwestern Newfoundland in the Port aux Basques area, as well as east to Burgeo, got quite a bit of impact in terms of the waves and a little bit of the wind as well, but mostly the ocean impacts were big with that one. So these tropical systems, these named storms that come up here, they have different characteristics. Larry was a much more, a smaller system, and Fiona was a much larger system. And these big hurricanes, or post-tropical storms, we sometimes call them, they produce extreme waves, extreme ocean impacts. And just from that previous slide, about once every 10 years, we in Newfoundland can expect to see a Category 1 strength tropical system, be it a Larry type storm or a Fiona type event. Now, Fiona type events are pretty rare, but at least once every 10 years we get something that's roughly that Category 1 intensity. Now the Hurricane Center is located in Halifax on the Dartmouth side of the harbor, and our building is here in the photograph. Is mostly government facilities there. The like in Gander, the Forecast Weather Office, Newfoundland and Labrador Weather Office. We have the Atlantic Storm Prediction Center, is basically the same role, predicting, issuing forecasts for the maritime provinces. And the Hurricane Center is essentially co-located with the regular weather office here on this lower level of the building. And you'll see there is a national lab. That's sort of our research part of what we do. So folks are working in there as well. So this is kind of the regional headquarters of Atlantic Canada with the Hurricane Center. Just a little look back at Fiona last year, just to remind you of some of the, what these storms look like when they're further in the south. As you know, they're more, more of a tropical looking structure with the eye, and the wind and rain is often roughly circular around the center of the storm. And I just highlighted in a graphics program here the areas where you typically get your wind, heaviest rain, and all the heaviest ocean impacts in the magenta there. And the rainfall is often quite complex. Back in 2010 when we had Hurricane Igor, a lot of the heavy rain that came in Newfoundland from Igor was from this. You can see there's this extension of in the left-hand image there, the big green area. That's also where you get a lot of rainfall with these storms. There's usually a weather front in that part of the storm, and with Igor, Newfoundland got a lot of the rain from that part of the system. And then with Fiona last year, this is only an 18-hour difference in these two satellite images and what I've drawn in here for the distribution of the wind. The map scale is similar in each, but you can see that, you know, how the storm structure changed so rapidly in just an 18-hour period, so less than a day. And the ocean waves and surge was, you know, significantly increased just over that small, you know, that short window of time. And when we think about, you know, preparedness, a big part of what we're talking about today is looking at how we can be, you know, prepared for these storms. And I like to think of it as a time scale, you know, think on longer time scale versus the shorter time scale, which is when, you know, our job at the Hurricane Center is basically forecasting the storm that's approaching. You hear it in the news, that you hear the name, that gets people's attention to start following. But when you think of, you know, longer term readiness, some of the key words I have on this slide here is to get you thinking on a longer term time frame, like well before a storm even develops. You want to be thinking in terms of, you know, property maintenance is sort of a big thing, and you know, where you are, particularly within your neighborhood. Are you near, you know, obviously a lower elevation? Are you in a low-lying area where flooding may not have occurred before, but you know, there's a risk of it occurring? Even changes in the neighborhood, like buildings, new properties going up, or, you know, paved areas, that can change the way water flows and rainfall, you know, the drainage occurs, you know, from one storm to another. You could have the same storm arriving a few years later, same intensity, same rainfall, but because buildings have, you know, construction has occurred in the region, that might affect how your property is impacted. And then, of course, during the season itself, that's when our job at the weather office is focused on the actual, you know, what time are these winds going to be moving in? And you're thinking of in terms of that 72-hour, that 3-day time frame of readiness, you know, getting together, you know, fuel, extra fuel for your generators, just extra cash on hand. ATMs might be down, power outages, those sort of things. So yeah, that's all I have for that, and we'll have questions in a bit. Thanks.
Well, hello, everybody. My name is David Day. I am the Manager of Emergency Safety Services with St. John's Regional Fire Department. Ultimately, I am responsible for emergency preparedness and response with the City of St. John's. So before I get started, for those of you who are visitors here to our fair city, I'm obligated to say welcome to St. John's. Make sure that you get out and you enjoy what the city has to offer, and also make sure that you spend a little bit while you're here. We certainly appreciate that as well. The restaurants, the gift shops will appreciate it, so please do that. So I'm going to take a little different approach. Still going to talk about weather, because we are Canadians, we are Newfoundlanders, so it's our sweet spot, is what we like to do. But I'm going to talk about climate change. And, you know, the question is it happening? And I think we can all agree that yes, climate change is happening. And to really, you know, drive that home, Mayor and Council in November 2019 actually declared a climate change emergency for the city. The reason why they did this is they really wanted to affirm that a climate change is taking place, and to try to deepen with, you know, our commitment as a city to protecting our community, our economy, our assets, and our ecosystems from the changes that climate change is bringing. The city also set climate change as a strategic priority, and as part of that, Mayor and Council directed staff to develop a plan that addresses greenhouse gas emissions and climate risk as it relates to the city. And if you're interested, that plan is on the city website, and I think it's found under publications, but if you just do a little search, you'll find it. So what are we seeing as a city when it comes to climate change and climate hazards. And I liked how Eddie and Ashley talked about, and Chris and David, that, you know, we do get bad weather, and it's just part and parcel of living here. But we can't ignore the fact that there are some extreme events that are taking place. And I'll give you some examples. I've been with the city now 11 years, and in my time, a couple things that I'll bring out that were significant to me. March 2017, the week the Briar was here. That Saturday, we saw a windstorm that could have been a hurricane, but it wasn't a hurricane, I understand. We saw winds that day of 145 km/h gusts. Pretty significant. We never had a whole lot of snow on the ground, but ground was frozen, which was good. So what happened is that a lot of infrastructure got damaged. Roofs lost their sheeting. There were some windows that broke in the downtown core. But one of the biggest impacts besides power outages is that as a city, we lost a significant portion of our traffic lights. They actually blew off the arms and broke. That's a wind event. The snow event, again, we have lots of snow here in the province, but 2020 stands out as a significant event. And Eddie, I'm glad you showed that little clip, because it really speaks to what our city operators who were out during that event had to face. And not only the operators, but police, fire, ambulance, who were also out during that event. I'll tell you that about 11 o'clock, shortly after 11 o'clock Friday night, a decision was made that we took a lot of the heavy equipment and we stationed it at the fire stations, health science, emergency headquarters, and the the ambulance substations. They spent the rest of the night escorting those vehicles to calls that were still coming in. I know there was one instance where a loader had to pick up the back of an ambulance by the bumper to get it unstuck. So it really speaks to how significant that event was. Rain events, again, we are a wet city, but we are starting to see some really extreme events. I go back a couple years when there was significant rain in the city, but we had sort of an, I don't know what to call it, but a micro event in the downtown. And Barter's Hill saw a significant amount of water, and it got underneath the pavement and rippled the pavement. And we actually had to repave majority of Barter's Hill. Last fall, you can see the picture in the top right is up in Kilbride. Again, we had a lot of major rain event, but again, in that area, we got more than normal. Some aging infrastructure, and what happens is, again, storm sewers get overwhelmed, and we get that rippling effect, and roadways and storm sewers get destroyed. Last but not least, temperature. I sit on a group of emergency managers that meet once a month virtually. And myself and the lady from Halifax always joke with the rest of the country that we don't have to worry about extreme heat temperatures here. Lo and behold, last summer, we had 3 consecutive days, high 20s with high humidex that resulted in heat warnings coming from Environment Canada. Not something that we see here all the time. We, as a population in Newfoundland, are not used to that high humidity and high temperatures, nor are buildings and our homes geared for high temperatures and high humidity. This past winter, high wind chills. And again, it was almost a week of these significant extreme weathers. Central Labrador obviously experienced this, but here in the city or Northeast Avalon, and the West Coast, the coastlines, we typically don't see anything past -10 as a wind chill. So again, this is kind of bringing to light what we're seeing the extreme hazards. So what are we as a city doing? Well, we are improving the resilience of our buildings, new buildings, roads, stormwater infrastructure for what we're seeing and what's being forecasted by the folks here on my right. The one problem with this is this takes time, and it takes money to make it happen. What we're also doing, though, is increasing the city's resiliency by informing staff so that of what changes we can expect, so that we can build plans around it. The city has taken the steps and has a manager of sustainability. So that individual is tasked with making changes related to climate change in the city. And I'll give an example of a plan that I look after where we have dealt with, or at least tried to address, our first attempt at climate change. And Amundo Fasto is the gentleman's name, and he came in this year, last year, and ran into this year. We have, from an emergency management standpoint, what's called a hazard risk analysis. Part of my job is to figure out what are the events that we have to be concerned about that would have major impact to the residents and the businesses of the city. And we did our best, and Edmundo came in and sort of gave us a different lens on looking at the impacts of rain, wind, things like that, so that we could have a better knowledge of what the impacts and consequences would be on the citizens for those type of events. We're also looking at, how we protect our coastal infrastructure. So that would be Outer Lower Battery, Fort Amherst, Kitty-Vitty. The other thing that we're trying to do, and being here today is a great means of it, is educating the public on the risks and how to prepare. So David has already introduced this, and Chris has talked about it, the 72-hour campaign. Who here had, prior to today, has heard of the 72-hour campaign? Okay, I'm seeing some good hands. If you were asked this to the general public, they wouldn't necessarily know what it is. If you asked them if they had their storm chips before the 20 centimeters was coming,
Yes.
they would know what we're talking about. So this, what I'm getting at here, and David has already said, 72 hours is trying to instill in everybody knowledge that, look, you need to be prepared for 72 hours before the roads open up, before we as emergency responders can help you. It's not that as emergency responders, we're not doing anything prior to that 72 hours. What we're doing is we're taking care of the critical industry that's happening within the area. So in other words, the hospitals, Newfoundland Power, and the vulnerable population. So what do we need to do to be prepared? Is the basic stuff: have some extra food, have medicine, have water, have first aid, have a battery operated radio. Don't forget about our furry friends that we have living with us. We have a puppy now, is only 4 years old, has no medication. But our 17-year-old beagle, who passed a couple years ago, had heart medication, thyroid medication, and a couple other things to go along with it. So we always had to make sure that good old Darb had her medicine along with us. I'll tell you a little bit about how we prepare at the city when one of these major events come. So there's a running joke at the office that when we see an email coming from David Neal, there's nothing good coming out of it. and we all get used to, have you seen that greenish, whitish tinge to his slide deck? Well, that's the information that we get. But we pay attention to it. And we get it at least 72, if not 4 days prior to the event that's coming. As the event starts to get closer and the diagnosis, as you talked about, starts to get better, we start planning. Within the city, there's a staff of about 30 people who, besides their normal day job, sit on an emergency management team. And what we do is we start to make plans for the event that's coming. And we pay heed to it, okay? One of the things, if I were to ask anybody to sort of take away from this presentation today, is to listen to the 4 people to the right of me. When they say that something as bad is coming, they're not fooling, okay? And we need to prepare for it. A retired firefighter once said to me, he said, the only thing that got burnt in a false alarm, in other words, responding to a false alarm, is fuel, okay? So if you get the meaning behind it, if we get ready and it doesn't turn out to be as bad as what it was forecast, well, you know what? That's not a bad thing. So I'll leave that with you. Emily.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. I'm not a meteorologist, I should say right off the hop. I studied environmental geochemistry, so weather and climate mean something drastically different when you're looking at rocks that have been around for hundreds of millions of years. But I'm so pleased to be here. I'm Emily Cumming. I'm the conservation manager with Conservation Corps Newfoundland and Labrador. We are a provincial environmental NGO dedicated to climate action and awareness through our Climate Change Education Center, as well as youth employment and training in the green sector through our Green Team and internship programs, as well as many other community-led environmental projects. David's already introduced climate change into this topic of extreme weather. It's a massive, all-encompassing topic and hard to do justice to quickly. But very broadly, I'll discuss some of the global trends we're seeing and what that means for us here at home in the context of preparedness. So globally, we are seeing and will continue to see increased rates, rapidly increasing rates of warming air, ocean, and freshwater temperatures, increased frequency of extreme weather events, and sea level rise. In Newfoundland and Labrador, a province that is overwhelmingly made up of coastal communities as well as remote northern communities that rely on permafrost and sea ice, some of our primary areas of concern are that extreme weather, the loss of that sea ice, the thawing of the permafrost, flooding, coastal erosion, and species migration that impacts our local food chains really, really seriously. Just going down the laundry list of these impacts, it's really important to acknowledge these impacts head on because knowledge is crucial in a climate emergency. But just going through the list doesn't necessarily do justice to how interconnected all of these systems are and how one change in our weather, in our climate, can impact everything around us. So our environment, our economy, and our society are all intrinsically linked. We have a bit of a tendency to separate the natural and human worlds. So the beautiful, open spaces, coastlines, and forests that we're so lucky to have in this province, we tend to think of those as separate from, our human infrastructure and industry. But in reality, they're deeply interconnected. And that interconnectedness makes talking about climate change really complex because these impacts aren't felt equitably in all cases. They're really unique and regionally specific. So again, listing those impacts and confronting the realities of species that our grandparents were used to seeing all the time disappearing. I think it's very easy to experience a sense of overwhelm or paralysis, and a bit like you're lost out to sea, much like our friend the polar bear here. So in the context of emergency preparedness, I think it's really important to acknowledge how difficult it is to prepare for these things. And it's really important to identify the areas in our lives, in all of our lives, that bring us a sense of connection, community, and hope. So paying a lot of attention in our day-to-day lives to the people, the places, the music, the art that gives us that sense of connection and hope is truly important. And that does feel like slightly fluffy in the context of emergency preparedness when we're talking about having first aid kits and flashlights on hand. But I think it's an important first step to having the capacity to take on any other preparedness that we can take on. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that a lot of us in this room and joining in virtually we probably started having these conversations about climate realities, about increased extreme weather as adults, and that's not the case for the younger generations. They are growing up in a world where these climate realities are a fact from day one. So I think it's really important to find that sense of connection and fortitude for each of us, but especially for the young people in our lives. And that sense of, fortitude, that sense of resilience that we have ourselves is a crucial first step in developing more resilient communities, as David has mentioned. And that can look like 100 different things, of course, for each of us, but we've been chatting about having provisions on hand for yourself and your family and your home. When you're getting those provisions and you're in a position to do so, that's a great time to look up what food bank in your area could use some of those supplies as well. When an alert comes through and we're feeling well prepared for it, that's a really great opportunity to think about. Maybe there are seniors on your street who don't have family nearby, or maybe a newcomer family has just moved in, might not have the app front of mind just then. In the same way that the impacts of climate change are really interconnected, our connections between each other are truly important. And I suspect I am sort of singing to the choir here, because I find in Newfoundland and Labrador, we are very community-oriented people. And multiple people have brought up the sort of aftermath of Snowmageddon. And I remember myself at the time, I was in a basement apartment in a neighborhood that had lots of basement apartments. And there was an immediate instinct from neighbors to come and check that everyone could get out of their homes right away as soon as the blizzard itself had stopped. But not only that, there was also an instinct to gather and talk and make that connection. And I think that's something that we're very good at doing. And that community resilience is one of the most important things we have going forward. Thanks so much. I look forward to your questions.
All right, so thank you very much. That was amazing. I'm sure all of you have lots of questions. And just a reminder, if you do have any questions, just to come up to this mic up here, because our virtual audience can't hear you if you don't come up here. So if you have any questions, just go ahead, raise your hand or whatever. Not one question. Perfect. Okay.
I have a question about the 2000 or 72-hour time period. I'm 70 now, and I'm recalling 72 hours for 20 years as being a preparedness time frame. And we're seeing an accelerated growth of weather events. Is it time to reach for 96 hours? As an example, we had Snowmageddon, which lasted about a week or so. That's my question. And the other question is this going to be posted on the internet?
Do we have a Zoom link that will be, yeah, okay, so there'll be the Zoom link that's there, it's being recorded, so yes, it should be there. We'll make that. Okay, perfect. I think the best person to answer that would be, do you want to take it?
I'll take the first crack at it, and then anybody else. I agree with you, and this is really speaking to the changes that we're seeing. 72-hour campaign has been around for a long time, but it really speaks to the fact that, if we are able, then we probably should. I'm a little bit overzealous. I have lots of gas for the generator and for the snow blower, and I have 2 tanks of propane and we have lots of food in the cupboard and in the freezer. We're lucky enough that we can do that. There are folks, in society who aren't able to do that, and like Emily said, it's a good point that if we are able to help those out who can't through the food banks, it's very important to do it. But yeah, we probably should start thinking about beyond 72 hours. Anybody else want to comment?
I mean, I can add a little to that. My mic on? Yeah. Can you guys hear me? Yeah, okay. I think the answer is yes, but I also think it's dependent upon the situation. Some big storms like Snowmageddon, they're generally the easiest to forecast. So, 3, 4, 5 days out, when you start to see that consistency, you can probably say, okay, this area should probably start preparing maybe outside of 72 hours. But there are a lot of events where we don't know where the worst impacts are going to be until 72 hours or less. In which case, if we're giving the widespread, everyone get prepared for an imminent severe storm, but 80% of the area you're talking about may not get it, I think it's kind of dependent on a given setup. But with this stuff starting to happen more frequently, I think at least getting the messaging out of this, 72 hours to be prepared more frequently, even by myself, which I don't think I probably harped on it enough, is something to deeply consider. But I think that as forecasting is better, we probably can lengthen that out.
But it's not even just forecasting out ahead of time. Sometimes these, systems aren't well forecasted, or we get a lot of rain in one area, and so whether there's a storm coming or not, we should just be prepared. I think that's the key to the 72 hours. I think it's being prepared, having that ready to go, just in case there is an emergency. The well forecasted stuff, sure.
Yeah.
But it's the other little things that we don't know are going to happen.
Like, let's drop 200 mils of rain, and the forecast was like 60.
Yeah. So little things like things like that.
This happens.
Thanks very much for your presentation. It's quite interesting. I got a couple of questions. One, just curious, in your world, how you arrive at a probability of precipitation of, and I was always thinking, if it happens to be 50%, well, I could do that. But anyway, I'd be curious to how you get there. The second one is, I'd like your explanation, if you may, on El Nino versus El Niña, and how that's going to impact our province. Thanks.
Anyone from the ECC want to take the pop challenge?
This is a fun one.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, the 50%, I know for our forecast, we don't put in 50%, just for that reason exactly.
51.
Exactly. So, really, at that point, is for especially for like larger regions, you're kind of expecting that's kind of the amount of that region that's going to get precipitation. A lot of times when we're kind of looking at it, you're kind of looking at isolated versus scattered. So basically 60%, you're kind of thinking a few light showers throughout pretty well most of the region. 40% is kind of just like some more isolated, might be a little bit, in more isolated areas. So it's kind of the thinking there. But no, we avoid 50% for really the reason you just mentioned is basically it's a coin flip at that point. So we don't put that one in our forecast.
Just know that, like, if we're right 30 or 35%, we'd be Hall of Famers in baseball. So
True.
we're better than that, especially these guys.
Oh, that's right, yes, the La Nina versus El Nino. This coming year, it's looking like the El Nino conditions are going to be prominent. And the El Nino, La Nina stuff is water temperatures in the Pacific Ocean, changes that happen on that side. And you might wonder, how does that impact our weather? These things in the atmosphere, they propagate, large distances. So basically, what you need to understand is that years when we expect El Nino, which we are seeing currently, and it will continue to occur through the summer, that is the prediction, that does tend to suppress hurricane activity in the Atlantic Ocean, so that affects Eastern Canada. But you know, we on average get 1 or 2 storms, tropical ones, affecting us each year, either the direct impacts or the sort of the tail end, the remnants. And even if there is El Nino conditions, if we just get that one storm that happens to track, you know, into Newfoundland or into Canada, anywhere, that could, you know, be a heck of a season, you know, it could impact you significantly. So it's, yeah, in general, so this year, the likelihood is a little bit less than average, but yeah, it just does take that one event, whatever it is, El Nino or La Nina.
Any other questions?
You have a question from virtually? Okay, yeah, after this, yeah.
Hello. I have lived in other places before I moved to St. John's, and here I have the feeling that the weather forecast is kind of bad. No offense. But I was wondering, is that just a feeling? Because maybe that always happens and you're always annoyed about why it keeps changing. Or does it have something to do with the location and Newfoundland being an island and it being located between Labrador Current and Gulf Stream? Or is it really just a feeling and the weather forecast always changes?
You're probably not wrong. I mean, you know, the forecasts are very challenging, and you know, the gentleman to my left here speak to that as well. But something about, you know, St. John's in particular is that a small change in wind direction can have a huge effect on temperature forecast.
Huge.
Like, you know, today the wind is from the south or southwest is 15, 16 degrees. If that forecast changed, you know, to southeast or east, that forecast of 16 drops to 6 or 8.
Or less.
Or less. And so that's why you can get these big variations, because 3-4 days out, you can get these small changes that in other parts of the country don't mean much. Like in the Maritimes, like a south wind, west wind, northwest wind, like doesn't do a whole lot. But here that can vastly change, especially on the Avalon. But if anybody to the left here wants to add to that, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, the other tricky part too is St. John's being right on the East Coast, right on this island. A lot of times too, when we're developing forecasts, we like to see kind of what's happening upstream, whether it's to look at kind of which forecast model's handling things a bit better, or just kind of seeing how things are developing. That kind of sort of analysis and diagnosis part of the forecast process. When you get some of these bigger storms, especially in the wintertime, they kind of come off the eastern seaboard. There's not a whole lot of observation data once they get out over the ocean. And then if you get something passing east of St. John's out of the ocean, a slight shift in track could mean the difference between, you know, a little bit of snow versus snowmageddon. So it's that also poses a big challenge, especially forecasting for this area of the island.
Yeah, one of my first,
No,
the ones
go
that
ahead,
went,
Dave,
it was
go ahead.
I think it was 2014 or 15. There was a big storm to the east of St. John's, and it was sitting out over the ocean for a couple of days, and there's not a lot of data out there. And the forecast models were basically forecasting that to back in a little bit and brush the Avalon with a few centimeters of snow and a bit of wind. So I went on air the night before, and I said, I think we're going to get winds gusting to 80 and, you know, maybe 15 centimeters of snow. I woke up in the morning, winds were gusting to 105, and we ended up with 55 centimeters. So, you know, that kind of stuff happens because we're kind of on the edge of where the good data is. So
Yeah,
it's
and we're a
challenging.
small island in the middle of the North Atlantic. So like literally any little change in the forecast track, anything can mean the difference between a great forecast and a busted forecast. And that's something we deal with every day. And I mean, one side of St. John's to the other side of St. John's can have totally different weather, right? And that's the case all across the province and every little nook and cranny. So it's very difficult to be right 100% of the time. Not even 100% of the time, but you know what I mean. We'll never get there.
We just want to be close.
Yeah.
We all just want to be
Close
close.
enough. Yeah.
I have a question, but I don't know how to word it.
Okay.
My question first is to you guys. Are we going to get summer? and another question leading up to that. You know, sometimes you say, in the long range, we can see it's going to be a great summer. Like, how do you predict something 3 months when you can't get it right in 3 hours?
Great question.
Oh, I gotcha.
So we can see trends, and that's really what I use a lot, is to see whether things are warming up, what the winds are going to be like, what systems are moving in. The winds really long range for us are a big thing, especially in the spring and the summer. If we see northeasterly set up, we are not happy. Like any sort of northerly setting up, we've got a ridge of high pressure somewhere that's spinning those winds offshore onto us, like onshore rather. We typically don't see very nice weather in the spring or even the summer. That could ruin a summer, right? And I know that happened just before I moved here. Good thing.
2015.
Yeah, 2015, and then again 2018, I think there was not a very good summer.
Yeah.
Hopefully that doesn't happen this year, but yeah, so that's what happens. So we see the trends, so we can give you an idea of what's going to happen. Can I tell you exactly how much rain is going to fall? No. Can I tell you what the temperature is going to be? Absolutely not. But I can tell you what the outlook looks like as far as long range, big picture kind of things happen.
Yeah, you can look at where basically over a 5, 10, 15-day period, we're going to have lower than pressure averages and higher than pressure averages with respect to weather patterns. And it took me a long time to kind of figure out how that may or may not impact our weather. But once you start to be able to recognize that, if you say, okay, well, there's going to be a mean low pressure over Greenland, 2 weeks out from now, you can bet your ASS that we're going to be in probably a lot of northeast wind for a large part of that forecast. So you can kind of get the gist of what the forecast will be, but sometimes the short range stuff is actually the hardest to nail down, depending on what the setup is. And does that make sense? Anyone want to add anything to that?
We'll wear it, it's okay.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, pretty well. We also do within ECC as well. We do have seasonal outlooks, but a lot of times when you're looking at those longer range, you're looking more probabilistic, and you're looking more in terms of normal. So you get an idea that there's a good indication that temperatures will be warmer than normal. How much warmer than normal is not going to necessarily tell you that, but it's going to give you a probability of like, oh, it'll be warmer than normal, it'll be colder than normal, that sort of thing. So that's a lot of times when we're looking longer range, we're looking at that. Also to just those different systems, 6-7 days out, as we've mentioned, to any like slight shifts in tracks. You could any slight shift in the wind direction, like say, could mean a difference between 16 or 6 as your high, that sort of thing.
Or rain and snow.
Yeah, those sorts of things. So basically, you just kind of you kind of leave a little extra detail out of that longer range, mainly for that reason. You just try to kind of stick to some of the more general details at that point.
And the answer to if we're going to see summer is eventually, and maybe for a week. I don't know.
That Thursday in July is going to be great.
It's going to be lovely. Yeah.
Really good talk so far, really glad. And regarding the weather prediction in Newfoundland, so I agree the observation, limited good observation is one issue. But what's the effect of the ocean? You know what I mean? We have an ocean around Newfoundland. How the role of the ocean could influence the prediction of the weather around Newfoundland? That's my question.
Tremendously.
A huge, yeah. You guys can take that one.
Yeah, well, yeah, anywhere close to the coast, if you're getting winds that are coming from off the water, a lot of times your surface temperature is going to be fairly close to what that sea surface temperature is. So that's going to have a definite cooling effect if you are near to the coast, and sometimes you don't necessarily have to go too far. Your temperature difference could be quite large in some regions as well. So yeah, definitely you get any flow off the ocean on here in Newfoundland, it has a big impact on your temperatures and on your conditions.
Like look at was it Thursday? Anyone here live out in CBS? So okay, one. So anyone in CBS will tell you that it's always like 20 degrees and sunny in CBS, but like you get a handful of days where like, I think was it Thursday, Rodney? Where it was like was like 1 degree downtown. It was like 16 out in like Mount Pearl. And so that's the influence of the ocean. You know, you get these sea breeze, and the ocean here is very, very cold. So you can have a tremendous difference in temperature over a short distance on sunny days when the wind is light. Synoptic scale wind is light.
Okay, go ahead. It's okay.
Online can go first. That's a...
Do you want to do that? The online question?
Sure.
Okay.
Why does my cat go crazy when there's a storm and she can know about it before anyone else does?
Can I take that cat to NTV with me?
That's funny. It's a weather forecasting cat, I guess.
I do have another more serious question too.
Okay.
How does St. John's combat coastal erosion from rising sea level and post-extreme weather events?
Unfortunately, that's me.
Yeah, that's you.
And that's a really hard topic to answer at this point in time. We are aware of it. We have some studies that are showing the impact, again, mostly on Kitty Harbor, Outer Battery, Lower Battery, Fort Amherst. So it's still under consideration. If we had the engineering department here, they could probably speak a whole lot better than what I can. But I know that we've acknowledged it. We have some studies on it, and from there, plans will be made.
Just kind of piggybacking off that, before we take another question, is like, I think we need to normalize talking about climate change a bit more, because not every weather event is necessarily driven by climate change. And a lot of people, especially on social media, will say, oh, it's cold, well, climate change isn't happening. But climate change is happening, it is real, and the big systems, like Fiona, these big rain events, even here, there's some percentage of that that's definitely driven by climate change. And it's something that we, need to just get normalized, and it can't be so politicized and taboo, because right now it's such a politicized topic, and whether you're right or left, it's happening. And there's nothing, that is going to essentially stop it in the near term. And so I think, as we move forward, we're going to have to figure out ways to communicate this and just make it a normal part of, our everyday jargon.
So I want to go back to Snowmageddon. And so when it occurred the night before, it was like, oh, a few flakes, great. I'll rush to the office, get stuff, come back, and hunker down. And then, colleagues asked after the fact, what was it like? And I said, well, it's like taking your house and driving on the highway to Port aux Basques and back at 100 kilometers an hour without stopping. That was about 24 hours with no less than 100 kilometers an hour. And then the other thing was the forecast was very impressive. It was like 91 centimeters, whatever, 91 centimeters it was, plus or minus a bit here and there. But what really struck me was, I like shoveling. Well, I really like shoveling snow.
Not anymore.
Not 100 centimeters.
But usually it's light snow everywhere in the driveway, and then wherever the snowplow goes, that's kind of heavy snow. In this case, it seemed like you were shoveling the end of your driveway all over your property kind of thing, not just, and it was this sort of medium density fiberboard, like snow consistency. And I saw on TV, you guys had people sculpting or making a TV on a sofa or whatever. But it was just that coming back, I would have never guessed that. I just looked at 91 centimeters of snow being shoveling 91 centimeters of snow. But this was like very heavy snow, but a bit like in the Arctic, you could cut things in a block and move it around. But I guess my question was, the forecast was absolutely right, but nobody said anything about impact or what it would mean or how many weeks it would take to clear the snow afterwards. And just sort of wondering, well, this was an anomaly, or hopefully an anomaly for the kind of snowstorm we had, was water mass in the snow versus just snow depth as far as a forecast, right?
Yeah, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that we did see 100-kilometer-per-hour winds over and over and over again, and that, you know, you see that all the time in the Arctic, for example, just from where I was forecasting. You know, blizzards and blowing snow create that dense snow, not only the temperature, but it's just the fact that it's being blown, right? So you're creating more dense snow in the first place. But I mean, we see snow with different densities all the time. We talk about really wet snow, cement snow, or really light fluffy snow. There are, you know, we do see those different types of intensities, but that's a good point. There are, when we communicate, and I'll speak for us, just communicating on TV, is, you know, sometimes the how heavy the snow is something that you can communicate, because we can see that kind of in the atmosphere. We can see, you know, what the temperatures are, and if it's going to be really fluffy snow or if it's not going to be very fluffy snow, if it's going to be really wet snow. Yeah, you go ahead.
No, and that's a tremendous challenge here.
Yep.
Because what might be, you can get a sense of, you know, the density of the snow based on temperatures aloft. But the rules in Newfoundland don't always like kind of work that way, because a lot of times we have these really strong storms which would create like really good fluffy snowflakes, but then it's windy, and so on the way down they kind of get ripped apart. And so you'll get, like as Ashley was saying, these really, you know, basically dense bits of snow that otherwise wouldn't be so dense. And then generally in storms, like the snow starts fluffy, it gets more dense as temperatures aloft warm, and it gets fluffy again towards the end, so you get this kind of weird sandwich, which I think also happened with Snowmageddon. And there was also a lot of snow on the ground before that too, which blew around, which probably added to that, because if you remember before Snowmageddon, it was cold and snowy. We had a very snowy late December, early January, and it was below freezing for a couple of weeks. So that snow was probably, and it was also very cold. It was like -10 when we started Snowmageddon. So that was blowing around. Then you had the snow falling that was being ripped apart by the wind, and temperatures got warmer aloft. So it's a whole complexity of issues when you're trying to make a forecast with respect to snow density, because that does mean, like, a lot of the storms that didn't really materialize late this year were because, like, the snowfall density was really hard to forecast. So we were looking at, like, what normally is like a, you know, you get, 10 centimeters of snow per centimeter of liquid was like 4 or 5 centimeters per that same centimeter. So,
and then it wasn't accumulating.
yeah, and it didn't accumulate. So does that make a bit of sense? Okay, I could ramble on for a while about that.
Okay, we talk about Snowmageddon. I want actually that to go back a little bit about this, the Snowmageddon, and also the climate change. So in the thinking of public, it's just, okay, this is a snow event, so kind of it's cold, it's not warming in a sense. So why actually climate change would be, for example, a trigger of a storm like Snowmageddon? Sorry, I didn't.
So I guess you're asking, like, how does that contribute to it? How does climate change contribute to a storm like that?
Because we think about it as warm.
I'm going to give you a hint. Okay, I know the answer because I've been a meteorologist, but is it actually that we are actually putting more energy into the system that we call the atmosphere and the ocean? And if so, I'm helping you here. If so, how does it work? So can you actually explain that?
Anyone want to take that?
Sorry, guys.
Talk a little bit about that. One of the big things that we're observing, and we know in climate change, will be warming in the higher latitudes compared to the tropics. And that change in temperature patterns in the Earth, that affects the jet stream patterns. So one of the big things we're starting to learn is that the jet stream doesn't move weather systems along as quickly as it used to. And you'll tend to get heavier snowfalls, heavier rainfalls, and you'll get more prolonged periods of drought or, you know, whatever weather condition, because the jet stream tends to meander and develop these large loops in it when you have this temperature warming in the higher latitudes, so at the poles. That's one of the big things. So you can get worse snowstorm even though it's global warming, climate change. That's why we often don't speak of it in terms of global warming per se, because a lot of the parts of the earth are warming, but it's the way that these temperature differentials between the poles and the equator are affecting the way the weather systems move. So you get these droughts that are more prolonged and rainfalls.
The other thing about climate change that people have studied as well is like as the difference in temperature between the poles and the tropics gets less, you'll get these bigger undulations in the jet stream. So like areas like Texas a couple of years ago had unseasonably cold weather. You know, they were down in, close to 0 Fahrenheit, which typically doesn't happen. And as climate change happens, you get these big buckles in the jet stream, which will send colder air to where it typically isn't, which again is kind of counterintuitive to this, global warming, but climate change is definitely the better.
Yeah, and when we talk about everybody uses this polar vortex as a, perfect example of that. It's the fact that that's what is responsible for winter in the northern hemisphere, right? But when we see these big fluctuations in the jet streams, that polar vortex sinks further south, which is exactly what he's talking about. So it's not necessarily, and I like that you said that about the global warming instead of using that climate change, is definitely because the climate is changing. That's just, we see that it's happening, and how that affects our weather. And for example, with hurricanes, we may not see more hurricanes, we'll just likely see more extreme hurricanes. So it's not that we'll see more weather, it's just more extreme weather. More frequently. Yeah. And that's that's what we need to prepare for. All of us, not just meteorologists, but all of us.
Good day. Really good presentations. I'm looking at you in twos, and twos. So, and it's going to be related to my question, actually. So, meteorology, the two meteorologists in the center, a very, very complex profession. I just, because I read a lot about these things. And then, of course, the reporters of what's happening, Ashley and
We're meteorologists too.
As well.
Meteorologists, I'm sorry, yeah. So reporters on that. And then we have Emily and David. Is it David? Yeah. And so I look at you four here, you're really giving results. Emily more so than David, but it's really the causes that I'm interested in. And I'm a just about retired architect, and so in our business, we've been looking at these things, climate change for, I'm working 45 years, so at least 25 years or so we've been looking at that. We have programs called Leadership in Energy Environment Designations, and we do our buildings and so on related to those, and I've been at national conferences and so on. But I'm really more interested in the causes, and because we don't hear a lot about it. Emily spoke about it. Thank you very much. And that's kind of her profession, Corps of Conservation Corps and so on. And as an example is, I was with a social justice organization in 2010, and we went to the Philippines. It was after a famous cyclone called Yolanda. It was famous because buildings were knocked down, ships were up on the yards and so on. But people were wondering, why is this happening? And so I guess and I'm sort of preambling, and my question is going to be, I think we really need to talk more about the causes of global warming and what's causing it. Someone mentioned about the weather changes, and we hear them out in the West Coast, out in Alberta. It's related to more carbon dioxide in the air. I mean, it's said there was a government, I looked at, there's a federal government report about it. And I think what we need to do is talk more about the causes and what we need to do, i.e. city, I don't think has any charge stations for electric vehicles. Now, not that you need them, because people in the city, and I have an electric car and I don't need it because I have a station at my own home, but things that city could do, and I know that it's very difficult. You don't have the funding in place to do more and more, and you're trying to do what you have. But maybe when you present the weather, Eddie and Ashley and I listen about you, maybe you need to talk a little bit about more the causes of these things, rather than just giving the results. I think we need to talk a lot more about these things. So maybe I can just leave that, and maybe someone can mention the word Gaia, the Earth, famous James Lovelock, who's famous person for this, world renowned and so on, talks about this. and he actually wrote a book on the revenge of Gaia and what Gaia is doing to us, what we're doing to the earth, and how we need to live together. So I just leave that. Maybe each of you could speak to that if you understand what I'm talking about. Thank you.
So I think from a city perspective, we've acknowledged it, as I mentioned, and the pace is a little bit slow, but we have ironically just installed some charge stations at City Hall. I think there's a couple at Paul Reynolds Center and a couple going in at the depot on Blackwood Avenue, but that has just literally happened, I think, since the winter is open, has been over. And there's also analysis looking at what light-duty vehicles can be changed over to electric vehicles to help stop our carbon footprint. Even simple changes this past winter, as part of the project, there's been an effort to go around and add weather stripping to windows and doors of city facilities. All of our bulbs have been changed out to LED, and we're looking at bigger changes such as taking out oil furnaces and changing them to electric. So that's just small things, and I know that as a city we have further to go, and that's just a couple things in the toolbox that we need to do and acknowledge the fact that there's others.
Thank you. Is this on? Yes. Yep. Thank you so much for your comments. I obviously, from a very biased perspective, I wholeheartedly agree. There really needs to be, and Eddie said this as well, there needs to be a bit of a normalization of talking about climate change in our day-to-day lives. And I did touch a little bit on the reasons why it's sort of a discouraging topic and not one we didn't necessarily want to think of when we get home from a long day of work and just want to put our feet up. But there is no debate really in the scientific community, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that these things are the result of industrial scale activities on our planet, human activity on our planet that's been going on since the Industrial Revolution. And that's, again, human and the human world and the natural world are one and the same. We are deeply interconnected, so we're not apart from that issue. We're a part of the issue and we're a part of the solution.
Yeah, I'm just thinking a lot on the personal level. Like we can all do our own part, and for myself, I do pretty religious with the recycling of products in the house. That's a small scale thing. I think one of the big things with the change too is not so much what's going on in the climate, but our behavior as humans too, where we're building more in prone areas, populating the coastlines. So it's hard to filter out when we look at the data, like we see this great increase in dollar losses per year when you look at the disasters, and a big chunk of that too is just our human behavior, where we're building in more prone areas, putting expensive real estate in prone areas. So a lot of what you see there is may not be exactly climate change or human induced changes. I think sea level rise is another big one too. That's something that is happening, not uniformly everywhere. Most parts of the world are seeing the water levels rising relative to the land. There's some areas where it's the opposite, but that trend is quite predictable. We have the data over the last number of years showing it, and then we know roughly in 100 years where that water level will be. So that's easy to predict value is one thing that we need to understand well. So if we're putting our properties and infrastructure in flooding areas, coastal areas, then that's going to be definitely a big factor, outside of whether the weather is changing. We have those factors.
Yeah, I'd echo a lot of what Chris had said, and yeah, getting back to those major events, that human behavior, that list that I kind of shared, kind of highlighting Hurricane Fiona, but number one on top of that was Hurricane Ian. And in terms of the numbers of the billions of dollars in damage and the loss of life there, again, that hit some very, very heavily populated areas in the United States, and that sort of that certainly lended to the overall costs there. But yeah, certainly I would agree with what Chris had said. Basically, just trying to make those kind of smaller changes on a personal scale to try and to help out in any way we can. In terms of any sort of higher level policy things, that's many steps above my pay grade at this point. But yeah, certainly if you can make those types of changes to help mitigate any of these issues, that's all the better.
Yeah, and I mean, when you look at these weather events, Ian, Fiona, they're all driven by a warming climate. The warming ocean contributes to the potential for these storms to be stronger, potentially bigger, more rain with them. Warm air holds a lot of water, so you warm the air a little bit, that's some percentage more of water energy that these storms have to work with. You ask, it's hard to tie any particular event to why is this event worse than the other one, and that's something that I think, unless I'm missing a lot of research on that, that's not 100% well understood, is what is the actual relationship between the CO2 and these weather events, other than it's causing a warming climate. That's kind of I think how that all interacts is still a bit of a mystery. Not a mystery, but I don't think it's completely understood. But the other thing is we're at a point now where we're not really going to, even if we all stopped tomorrow using carbon, the climate's still going to warm. There's a big lag there. So we're at the point now where we have to start essentially mitigating the impacts from the warming climate, because we're not going to really prevent it at this time. And so how do you do that? Maybe you don't build and develop the areas. Maybe you start trying to fortify areas that are going to see more rain or more storm surge or more high tides. Newfoundland Labrador is very interesting because a lot of the coastline, some areas are really prone to coastal flooding, but a lot of areas, there's a big elevation gap between the ocean and where we live. So in all areas, we won't see it the same. But breaking it down, some areas will see climate change impacts more frequently here. But essentially, I think what's left to do at this point is start to figure out, what we can do as individuals, and what governments can do in a whole is to mitigate
Our risk.
our risk to these events that are driven in part by the warming climate and climate change.
Good. Okay, that was great. Oh,
We've got one minute, so this is our last question,
Okay.
I think.
I just have one question. I'm wondering, I've spent some time in the southern US, which has definitely had its fair share of hurricanes, most recently spending some time in Florida. What really struck me is that the difference of the impact of a Category 1 hurricane, for example, in Florida compared to up here is dramatically different. And I think a big part of that is because they're so frequent down there, they've designed their building codes to respond to this. The buildings are required to manage stormwater in a way that's not going to cause flooding. They're required to have tie downs on their roofs and things like that. And I'm wondering if, David in particular, if you're seeing that the municipalities are starting to change and starting to put some regulations in place to bring some of these building codes and things up to speed to make them more tolerant to what's coming climate-wise.
So I know that the National Building Code is what we as municipalities is our Bible. And I believe that has been updated recently. And that's where these changes are starting to be built in. I know that when you look at the infrastructure here in Newfoundland and St. John's, we're pretty resilient. It's almost like those who build, whether it be our architects or engineers or carpenters, know naturally what our weather is like, and they put that a little extra in to make sure that it can sustain what we see. Even I look at Newfoundland and Labrador Power, or Newfoundland Labrador Power, their network is really resilient, And they've spent a lot of funds over the past few years to make it that way. And it's because they know, I guess, what's coming, what they've seen in the past. And, you know, it's, I guess it's a way of Newfoundlanders.
You just look at the difference in, like, when we get 100-kilometer winds in the winter, we'll have power outages in like the tens. Those same winds are in Nova Scotia, they got power outages in the tens of thousands.
Yeah.
So, you know, we are pretty well insulated from high winds here, but, you know, when you're talking about gusts to 140, 150, that's, the force also goes up dramatically after, I think, 110, 120 kilometers an hour. The force on surfaces and buildings goes up pretty exponentially the higher it gets. So.
I speak to my colleagues across the country, and again, referring to myself in Halifax, they panic when they get wind gusts of 85.
Yeah.
That's
and myself
here.
in Halifax are on these calls saying, well, we don't even blink an eye till they hit 120 or 110, and we don't get concerned till they hit 120 because we know that the infrastructure can actually withstand it.
Yeah, but then there's a difference too, that those impacts versus winter impacts versus summer impacts. We have trees that are in full leaf. We've got ground that is, you know, not frozen. So, you know, it's different. The wind at 120 kilometers per hour in the summer is very different than 120 kilometers in the winter. So those are also things we all also need to be aware of, right? We know our property, we know the trees and all that sort of stuff.
There's a lot to consider in
Yeah.
any of this stuff.
All right, that was great. Thank you all very much for that. Thank you all for joining us today. That was very wonderful. We do have a couple of door prizes, I think quite a few door prizes that we're going to give away here. Thank you. Oh, numbers, okay.
Those are all the tickets.
Everybody has tickets?
How many do we have? Any door prizes?